I'm Patrick. As I said, I'm a full stack developer. Uh, and my personal website's there, patrickdlandy.com, with more, my LinkedIn and contact info. So yeah, a little bit about me. So I attended Cornell University. I studied mechanical engineering. And then right out of school, I went to work in the HVAC industry in New York City for 4 years. Um, that was that was my first like career out of college, and from there, for a number of reasons that I'll get into, I decided to transition out of that industry and into web development via App Academy. And so I attended App Academy in the August 2019 cohort, and that was a full stack web development curriculum, and I graduated in November of 2019. Um, I'm very interested in effective altruism, which is a community um, and a social movement that's based on philosophy and ethics and career impact. And I hang out at a lot of their meetups, and I read the forums and the books. And yes, I'm very interested in that. I play a little bit of piano, and I have the Earth here because I'm very concerned about climate change, and that's one thing that I want to work on throughout the course of my career. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the Good Food Institute. Um, so basically, GFI is a 501c3 nonprofit working internationally to make alternative proteins like plant-based and cultivated meat delicious, affordable, and accessible. GFI advances open access research, um, mobilizes resources and talent, empowers partners across the food system to make a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. So I want to zoom in on this idea of alternative protein. So it's really, really hard to convince a lot of people to go vegetarian or vegan. It's kind of been flat as a percentage of the global total. And if your goal is to reduce the environmental impacts of agriculture, and you want to transition away from, beef consumption that is driving pollution from factory farming, um, it's kind of a hard sell to just run around telling everyone to be vegetarian. And this kind of messaging really hasn't worked at a large scale. So the idea is, if you can create protein for people that gives them what they want, which is the taste of something like beef without that environmental impact, that's the theory of change, that we address that problem by giving people products that can compete with traditional factory farmed meat. Um, so um, I will go to, yeah, so this point I want to make with this is that I'm not an expert at alternative protein. I am, just a web developer. However, software engineering can amplify the impact of a nonprofit org. So what you can do as a web developer is go and work directly for an organization that is already an expert in fixing a problem, and you can make them more effective by making their websites better, speeding them up. You can set up a whole new website for an organization, and you can also be mission driven within the organization instead of having them having to hire contractors that may not necessarily really care about the details or care about the products being good. You can add a lot of value to a nonprofit org as a web developer. And that's what I'm trying. That's what I'm working on now. So, I'm using my coding skills to advance GFI's theory of change. Um, I'm just making a disclaimer. I'm here representing myself and my own views, and not representing officially the views of GFI. This allows me to talk about more things in the discussion. Example, if we get into politics, I need to follow the rules that allow nonprofit engagement in politics. So I'm here representing myself as an individual. Okay, so I'm going to just apologize for badly using a meme from about a decade ago. But this right here is this one slide. If you remember one thing from this presentation, this is the core of what I want to talk about. So what if I told you that your software cover letter will stand out if you write about an ethical goal? So just take a second to think about that. You're up against uh, a database full of other people's cover letters that are screened by robots. And then when people get the ones that come out of the pile, they see the same thing over and over again. They see the same tricks. We know that the hiring system's really broken. You want something that's going to help you stand out in a crowded applicant pool. And from a purely selfish standpoint, you actually can do that if you make a really interesting, specific, compelling case that you have a goal to fix a problem that you're personally invested in. And I've experienced this firsthand where people pulled my cover letter out of the pile because I wrote something interesting about climate change in it. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about how to stand out as an applicant. So yeah, just a few topics I'm going to focus in on next. I'm going to talk about the tech job search. I'm going to talk about the importance of personal fit in the job search, and then tying those things together in planning for an impactful career. Okay, so tech job search. Here's all the nitty gritty stuff that you would probably expect, and I'm going to go over it. If you attended a boot camp, you probably went over similar strategies, but here's some useful tips that worked for me. So what worked? So from the App Academy curriculum, I did 2 projects, the full stack app, the pure JavaScript and data viz app. So that's what the curriculum told us to do. But if you did something different, that's also fine. What you want are a couple of things that you have dug deeply into and that demonstrate your expertise with the technologies that are used by them. So, this was React, Redux, and Ruby on Rails for the full stack. And then for JavaScript, this was D3.js and pure JavaScript, hosted on Heroku and GitHub pages. And yeah, these were great. They did what they needed. They did what I needed them to do, which was just demonstrate proficiency with the technology and have something to talk about, something to work on as I'm doing my applications. This is really important. So you need a tech resume that's going to be read by an ATS, application tracking system. So basically, a bot is going to read your resume, and so you should test it using online tools like JobScan to make sure that your resume isn't just going to get red flagged by a bot and never read. That's the first layer, is that they're just going to get thrown into these giant databases of resumes by machines. And you have to fight that by being prepared and making sure that your resume is going to get through that automatic screening. Then it's going to get read by people, and so you want to have multiple eyes on it. Get your friends to look at it, preferably get some people who work in tech to look at it. If you know a recruiter that's a friend and not just trying to hire you, get them to look at your resume and give you feedback. So you want to optimize it for bots and for people. LinkedIn. I can't stress this enough. LinkedIn is hugely important for the job search. I found my current job on LinkedIn, and the other job offer I got when I was comparing 2 job offers was through a LinkedIn quick apply. And I was shocked that a quick apply resulted in a callback and then getting through the interview pipeline, but it did. And so yeah, it's a really powerful tool. I would invest time to make your profile stand out and to use it when you're networking. I had a weekly application quota. So I set a goal for submitting a certain number of apps per week. That was App Academy's policy. You had a coach, and you had to submit a certain number per week. Yeah, so that really put a fire under me and got me to practice getting these applications out, because it is a numbers game. And I made a spreadsheet, track the status, make sure I was following up with everything on time. So mock interviews. These are just really good to kind of get you used to the flow of responding to technical questions and also responding to personality questions. If you can get a friend, find some questions online, just sit in a room and have them interview you. That's really, really helpful. Networking. Yeah, it's really helpful to attend events. I know it's really hard during the pandemic to get value out of this, because it's really different when you're on Zoom. But when things start opening up, Even if you're working, or if you're still job searching, or if you're looking for a second job and you're in a first job, it's really good to try to get to these events online for now, in person later. Meetup.com just has a lot of stuff. I like the New York City LinkedIn Tech Talks, are very good. I went to a few of those before the pandemic. Yeah, and just keep adding to your LinkedIn, keep meeting people, get their business cards, have conversations, talk about technology. This is going to help you get through the opaque first layer of an application. If you meet someone and you make a connection and you're applying there and they can help you, it really, really does make a difference. And then, yeah, this big question, which goes back to the cover letter and the mission: what will this company remember about me? Ask yourself that when you're writing something. Like, what, when someone in their HR department, or if a recruiter has to go through thousands of resumes, what about you is going to make them go, oh, I remember that person? And my argument in this talk, if you remember nothing else, is if you have a specific goal for positive impact using technology, and you can articulate it, yeah, they'll remember you. They'll be, oh, there's that, like, for me it's climate change. Oh, it's that person who wrote about climate change in their cover letter. I've had people tell me that's why I stood out. And I think it'll help you. So yeah, on the personal projects, this is my JavaScript project. It's just a screenshot here. It's a D3 visualization. It's um, just an example of incorporating your focus, your ethical focus, into a project. So this shows New York City's annual greenhouse gas emissions in a sunburst chart using D3, hosted on GitHub pages. It's not impressive from a UI or UX standpoint. It's not great. It's not something I'm looking back on it. I'm like, wow, there's a lot that I didn't do with this. But at the time when I was searching for jobs, it did the job. It was basically telling the story. I want to use software engineering to help keep track of carbon emissions, and that's really critical for addressing climate change, because we have to quantify the problem. And there was a career fair, and I had this up on a screen, and I was explaining it to people, and I was just creating this narrative about the goals that I have and what I want to work on. And it was, it did the job. It did the job. And looking back, it's like, wow, this is terrible user interface, terrible user experience, all sorts of issues with accessibility. But at the time, it did what I needed it to do. That's just an example of sort of expressing your goals through a project. Yeah, really quickly, I want to talk about personal fit. So take the time to think about your personality type. This is huge. This is one of the reasons I left the industry that I was in, is that it was just a very poor fit for the kind of person that I am. It was very high energy, long hours, very like, you go into meetings and argue with people, and you negotiate, and you sort of have these constant battles about scoping projects for construction. Some people are very good at that. Some people are, very, they pull social energy from interactions like that, and I just don't. It just sucks the life out of me. So yeah, do you enjoy working with people? Think about that, because software jobs range from extremely isolated remote work, especially now during the pandemic, to being constantly immersed in a team, or constantly interacting with clients, for a software company. And there's a huge spectrum there. So there's think about how much you want to be exposed to people, because you do have some choice in the kind of positions you want to aim for, in terms of how much people interaction you have in your day. Technical track versus other tracks. Yeah, so every company or org has its own set of positions and internal promotion tracks. But there are many, many, many roles that require software development experience, but not all of them are, deeply, deeply technical. You can take a technical track which involves becoming a domain expert and management. Eventually, you're going to have to manage people technically. But you can also take on a more people-focused role. For example, software sales. You can work towards roles in middle or upper management that are client-facing. You can, be an instructor at a boot camp, or a counselor at a boot camp. And that could be technical, or more soft skills related as well. Or you could work in technical recruiting. And these are all totally valid career paths. And you might find one that you would be really happy doing. So we want to move away from the idea that any one of these things is superior to the others. Because if it's a good fit for you, then that's all that matters for your career and your personal goals. Yeah, so startup versus big company. So basically, this is a question of how much structure do you want in your role and in your workday. At a startup, it's going to be looser, it's going to be faster. You're going to have to react to situations and be a jack of all trades. And then at a bigger company, you might get something that's more structured. It'll have a job description that's kind of um, more specific about what you're supposed to do. The teams will be more organized. There'll be a hierarchy. um, it might not be vertically very very deep, like you can still have a very flat hierarchy, but it can still be extremely organized. So yeah, just think about that, think about what kind of environment you think you want to be in. And yeah, so this comes back to my discussion at the beginning, nonprofit versus private sector. So this comes down to a lot of personal factors. Nonprofits offer some really incredible opportunities to make a huge difference on an issue that you're passionate about solving. Um, the reality of the matter is the private sector will almost always offer higher salaries. That's just statistically true. Um, you have to weigh those two things against each other based on your personal circumstance. This is not a situation where there's any judgment for taking a private sector job. There are all sorts of reasons where um, there's all sorts of ways in which I had a lot of privilege being able to do what I'm doing. Involving my personal circumstances, being able to afford to work for a nonprofit salary and not, being put in a position where I have to maximize income at this phase of my career. All sorts of factors why someone might need the money now. Um, the Basically also think about what languages, frameworks, and technologies you want to work on, because yeah, there's stuff that probably is only going to be private, like robotic process automation related applications, for example. That's probably going to be mostly private, you know especially like medical technology related applications, like all sorts of examples where if you want to work on that, it's probably going to be a private company. So that might make the decision for you. But then if you're working on a tech stack, a web application, and that it's used by nonprofits, um, that might be good for you, because a nonprofit will give you the opportunity to work on that tech stack. So um, yeah, so a lot of factors here, but something to think about when you're applying. Okay, so this brings us to planning for an impactful career. I'm going to talk briefly about a few ideas, but here are the goals. So here's what I mean by impactful in this context, and obviously this is super subjective. There's no one right way. This talk is not advocating for a specific right way to approach this, but here we go. So your career solves problems in a way that is consistent with your ethics and your morality. Again, that is person to person. That is, there's no framework that's the right framework for this. It's just what is consistent with your personal values and your goals. And your career is sustainable for you in terms of mental and physical health, engagement, and balance. So why am I including that? Like, why should we talk about this? Like why does this matter for impact? And the argument I'm going to make is you're going to be more impactful if you can sustain your work over a long period of time, and you can build experience, and you can dig deep, and you can build yourself into someone later in their career that has a lot of power, a lot of influence, and a lot of skills. And if you can set yourself up to work on this problem, or the set of problems you want to work on for a long period of time, you're going to be more effective. And in order to do that, you have to figure out this balance of how you're going to work on this in a way that is mentally and physically sustainable. So yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about a concept and an organization called 80,000 hours. Um, so this is approximately how many hours you have in your career. Um, that's it's a lot of time. This is just an estimate. It's going to vary person to person, depending on what you do, how long you live, etc. how can you best use these 80,000 hours to solve some of the world's most pressing problems? That's the question sort of posed by this presentation. And then thinking about these 80,000 hours, would you spend 0.1% of your career planning how you want to spend the remaining 99.9% of your career? Um, if the answer is yes, that's 80 hours. So even if you just spent 0.1% of this time trying to figure out and optimize, like, what is the best way to work on this, to work on problems, the best problems to focus on, the best sorts of jobs to apply to, you know, it might be worth spending some time on this, because you do have this huge opportunity to use this time to do something great or a whole bunch of different great things. And to answer this question, of like, what do you do with these 80,000 hours? There is a nonprofit called 80,000 Hours. They publish career resources, including podcasts. They have a jobs board. They have online guides talking about career planning. And, you know, I found it really helpful. It's not the only way to think about career planning, but I found it extremely valuable when I was going through the process of leaving my previous industry, the process of picking a boot camp, the process of applying to jobs out of the boot camp, and now I still use it, to think about the future. So, that's a resource that I will link to in my resource list at the end. And apologies in advance for butchering another meme, but I'll just let you read the Drake meme here. Um, yeah, so you want to consider where your tech skills will have the greatest impact. Um, and in order to do that, you have to spend some time planning. You have to think about how to spend these 80,000 hours. And this is sort of a segue into the next idea, which is like, what actually is positive impact? And again, super subjective. So I've got some areas here that definitely need people to work on them. We've got, improving the criminal justice system, especially in the United States. You've got racial justice. You've got the risk of nuclear war. You want to work, we need to work on policies to prevent the misuse of artificial intelligence. We need people to work on preventing climate change and reducing pollution. We need people to keep on delivering vaccines and preventing deadly diseases. There's, the abuse of animals in the factory farm system and the pollution caused by the factory farm system. There's democracy concerns. There's participation in government, and there's COVID-19 still going on. We still have to fight COVID-19, and we need to do work to prevent the next pandemic. And all of these things, you could make a huge positive impact working on any of these issues, and there are so many other issues that you could dedicate time and resources to working on. And the ones that you choose to work on might be ones that you're already interested in. You might have come to this talk already knowing what you want to work on, and that's great. But also, if you don't have a sense of which direction you want to go in, that's also totally okay. Um, and 80,000 hours is great as a resource for sort of thinking through this process of like, where do you want to direct your time and resources. There are also problems not listed on this slide that are specific to tech. If you're going to be a software engineer, there's a whole bunch of problems that you might encounter or you might be interested in just by being in the tech industry. And I will cover those on a slide later in the presentation. So thinking through this, I'll talk a little bit about effective altruism and some of its core principles, which were helpful to me as I was trying to think through these things. So the question is, how can we use our resources to help others the most? And the biggest takeaway is to focus on evidence and analysis, and to try to really quantify the kinds of impacts you want to have, and to look at work people have done to try to review, like, how many lives can you save, or how much suffering can you reduce, by doing an intervention. For example, distributing global health resources to prevent diseases that are completely preventable. Like if you're going to do that, how can you do that the most effectively and save the largest number of people? And And so there's frameworks for prioritizing problems too. So some specific problems are really pressing, solvable, and relatively neglected. And wouldn't we want to get more people working on those things, like so that they can have a bigger impact? And that's the kind of these are mostly thought exercises, but I found them to be very, very helpful in planning out my career moves. And one big takeaway from this is that donating to highly impactful charities is a great way to have a positive impact, and it's not the only way. Now, that might seem trivial. You might say, "Oh, well, big deal." But I'm talking about how I chose to go work at a nonprofit. That works for me. It might not be the path for everyone. You might want to go into the private sector. You might want to start in the private sector, build skills, and then move to the public sector. And there's all sorts of pathways you can take that are consistent with your ethical goals. But um, if you are in a position where you are making a very good salary as maybe a senior software engineer or a manager, you can have a massive impact just by choosing to donate to an impactful charity. And I'll go over sort of a thought exercise on this. So this book, Doing Good Better by Will McCaskill, has a thought exercise talking about how many lives you can save in a career. And these are estimates. This is, it's a little contrived, but it gives you sort of an idea of like thinking about magnitude, right? So 40-year career, an average salary across disciplines, and saving a life for $3,400 by distributing malaria prevention. So let's say you're a doctor in the United States, and you save throughout the course of your career, maybe 4 people, like directly, where your operation was the reason the person didn't die. And of course, if you're a trauma surgeon, you're going to save like many, many more people. But maybe if you're a dermatologist, like you don't directly save anyone's life, but you have a huge positive impact on hundreds and hundreds of lives. But if we're thinking about like, okay, I want to go save lives with my career. There's an argument that you should go be a doctor in Uganda because of the access to healthcare resources. You're going to save many, many, many more people because of the kinds of operations you're doing. So let's say you save 300 people by being a doctor in Uganda. Let's say you're a doctor in the United States and you're in a specialty that pays a lot, and you're really generous and you donate $100,000 per year to Against Malaria Foundation. Again, conservatively assuming $3,400 per life saved, you could save 1,176 people throughout the course of your career. And that is such a massive difference between the first scenario where you don't donate anything and you save 4 lives directly. It is such a huge difference that it might be worth thinking about these kinds of impacts when you are deciding how to use your time and how to use your resources, that you might find a way to have a huge impact on something. Well, here the metric is lives saved. Let's say you're a software engineer. Let's say you rise to a management position, you're making good money, and you decide, okay, I'm going to give $10,000 of my income away every year. And I know people who do this, and I know people who give a lot more than that. It's not an unheard of thing to do. Throughout the course of your career, if you give $10,000 per year, you could save 117 people throughout the course of your life. And that's in addition to whatever you do directly through your work as a software engineer, or any volunteers hours you spend working as a software engineer, or doing anything else. So just by donating, you could save 117 people. So that's the kind of thought exercise that this that effective altruism encourages, to say like, oh, well, maybe there is a way for me to go save a bunch of lives, or maybe there is a way for me to really effectively reduce carbon emissions and prevent climate change. So that that's the thought exercise. And it's obviously very reductive. There's all sorts of reasons why this may not be accurate, but I find it very valuable when thinking through these things. So now I'm going to talk about some things that are specific to tech, that software engineers are in positions to address and to respond to varying degrees, depending on what sorts of jobs you decide to take. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is an issue in technology specifically. It's pretty clear based on statistics that there are representation and wage gaps in STEM jobs, and specifically computer science jobs, along the lines of gender, race, and LGBTQ status. And I have a link in the resources to a Pew Research social trends study that sort of breaks this down if you want to learn more. There are destructive incentives in social media. There are, business models that depend on changing the opinions of users, and that can be harmful to democracy. And it can be really damaging to mental health. And there's a really good documentary about this called The Social Dilemma. If you haven't seen it yet, it's on Netflix. There's unethical uses of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So poorly applied statistical models can negatively affect large groups of people. That's right now, today. These are things that that can be very destructive, particularly when evaluating things like recidivism in the criminal justice system. I've heard a pretty powerful argument in this book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, that the statistical model that US News and World Report uses to rank colleges is actually very destructive because the cost of tuition is not factored into the model. And so colleges are scrambling to get their ratings up, and um, tuition has skyrocketed. And I'm not saying that one caused the other, but it's interesting that the cost of college and student loan debt isn't factored into the ranking. So that's one example of ethics colliding with how models are used to rank and evaluate things in the real world that affect real people. And as artificial intelligence and machine learning become more powerful, that's going to become more of an ethical problem over time. Yeah, so then we've got uh, energy consumption and cryptocurrencies. If you know anything about Bitcoin, you know that it electricity. A lot of that is produced by coal plants that are emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And yeah, there's a lot of really interesting work on blockchain looking to how can we get away from this energy consumption consensus algorithm. There's the proof of stake consensus algorithm that the Ethereum network is looking to move to. That's more energy efficient. So that's something really interesting that you might want to work on. And then there's defense and surveillance contracting. Yeah, there's a lot of companies that sell products to military, sell products to local governments, police departments, for the purposes of surveillance. Something to dig into, something to think about. If you're applying to a company, look at who their clients are. If there's something that doesn't feel good, does something that you're not ethically aligned with, then that might be something that guides your applications. Okay, so I'll wrap up with some action items. Basically, the big takeaway is you can stand out in the job search by focusing your materials on ethics and problem solving. That's that. If you remember one thing from this whole presentation, it's that. I would encourage you to consider personal fit in job applications, interviews, and evaluating job offers. Consider your personality, and make a short-term plan for impact. And specifically, what does that mean? Here's some ideas based on effective altruism, based on my personal experience. Donate to effective charities or invest in mission-driven startups if you can, if you have the means to do that. You can directly work for a nonprofit specific to your problem area. Specifically work for a mission-driven startup specific to your problem area. And there's all sorts of, if you're interested in climate change, there's a whole field emerging called climate tech. And there's a lot of startups that are working on technology solutions to climate change. So that might be a good fit for a software engineer looking for employment. Use your influence at your job to solve or draw attention to some of those issues I mentioned that are specific to the tech sector. And apply to jobs that fit your ethical standards. That might be just excluding certain companies that aren't aligned with your personal ethical worldview. And thank you for your time. I think I'm a little bit over, but we can have a little bit of a discussion. I have some resources, and I will drop that link into the chat. So thank you.
Awesome. That was I don't like that was a lot of information, and I think that it's really interesting because I think not everyone puts it in the perspective of how do I match my personality to the work that I'm looking for. I think sometimes there's a lot of resumes that get pushed out blindly, like you see an opening and you just go for it. There's no, especially when you are trying to, again, I'm going to talk about breaking into the industry. When you're breaking into the industry, and if I appreciate the fact that you did address privilege, because not everyone has is in that spot where you can, you know, you can look at nonprofit because, you know, like you said, they don't necessarily pay as much as the private sector. um there's a lot to take away from there. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Patrick, are you okay to open up the floor to Q&A?
Yeah, totally. And in response to the chat, I'm going to put a PDF of the slide deck on this GitHub repo, and you'll be able to see it there.
Cool, perfect. All right, guys, I'm going to open up the floor for Q&A. Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask Patrick a question directly. It does make a difference in terms of making a connection with someone. So if you're comfortable to not just drop your questions in chat, and you also sort of get more exposure on how to ask questions.
Patrick, can you tell us why you chose the current company you work for? I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, but like what drew you to them?
Totally. Thanks, Mike. So I was thinking through options during the job search. I was applying to both nonprofits and private sector companies to keep my options open and just to see what would come back in terms of responses, because there's no real way to know during the job search what kinds of hits you're going to get and what kinds of people are going to respond. And I did get some responses from unrelated software companies in the private space, but of all the nonprofit applications I got back, this one this one I had a really good dialogue with. And the reason that I applied to it in the first place is that they had a particularly good intersection of the issue of effectively addressing climate change and effectively addressing the problems of factory farming, which I also feel strongly about. And I came to that conclusion from a long time ago. So I've been vegetarian in some form for a long time, and so in terms of my personal ethics, there was this alignment where this group was interested both in the animal suffering aspect of it, but it was also a climate solution. And in terms of effectiveness, in terms of like, I want to use my career to fight climate change as effectively as possible, I found their theory of change to be very compelling. Effective altruism helped me sort of like think through it, and effective altruism introduced me to this organization. um, I heard people talk about it. I met someone who worked there before I saw the job post, and that's an example of the value of networking. But in terms of climate change, I think something like 15%, 14 or 15% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions are from some sort of land use, and a lot of that is livestock. And so, and a lot of it is food, like clearing rainforests to grow food to feed to livestock. And so knowing that that is such a big chunk of the emissions, and that you want to think about, quantify, like, okay, maybe we can reduce that portion of the emissions by changing the food system, reducing the strain on resources caused by growing livestock. So you know that's how I decided to apply. And then once I was applied to everything and I got stuff back, and I was like, okay, I have to choose where I'm going to work. The Good Food Institute is where I decided to go, partially because of what I just described with the mission, but also personality and work-life balance. It was a culture that I fit in with. It's not a company. It's not a job that I have to work a ton of overtime. And it really just fits with my lifestyle well, and it allows me to pace myself. It allows me to do some self-learning, and it's just, yeah. That sums it up.
I wanted to jump in for a second. It just what you were saying triggered something, and I was thinking about a different approach of, when you're trying to connect your values with the companies that you're sending out your applications to or connect with. You can also take a different approach of the companies that are making a positive impact in those sectors. So thinking of Patrick's story of, I'm also a vegetarian, by the way. I've been a lifelong vegetarian. And you can also think of companies that are making a positive impact, or like, for example, alternative meats or companies that support that initiative. So it doesn't necessarily have to be nonprofit, but you can look at the values and the mission that they're driving towards, and if that aligns with what you're looking for. There's lots of different ways of going and navigating so that there's this feeling of like when you're working for a company that you feel proud of. It's just you're the way that it impacts your life and the positivity that you get back. I'm sure we've all been there. I've definitely been inside companies that I didn't necessarily align with, and it does eat away at you. So it changes your life. But I want to go back to the questions.
Definitely, in response to that, I would say the startup, like, just, I can guarantee you there's a startup working on it if it's a problem. And so especially if you're looking for that first tech job, you might be able to make a really good case to a startup that's trying to solve one of these problems. And I see a lot of them in climate change. There's a lot of climate tech startups out there. And you might say, you might be a really good fit because you have this energy, you care about the problem they're trying to fix, and you might be a really good fit for that. So yes, a private sector startup might be another way to do that. And I mean, it depends on how early stage it is, but yeah, you can potentially make a lot of money doing that as opposed to specifically joining a nonprofit. Yeah. I do see one in the chat. So did your motivation and learning capacity increase because of that, because of applying what you have learned in these good for? Yeah, so totally. I found a community, and the community aspect of the effective altruism movement gave me a lot of motivation and a lot of personal fulfillment. And I met people who were very different from me, but also I met a lot of people who are in tech. I met a lot of software developers through the meetup.com groups. Before the pandemic, I was going, maybe once a month to a meetup.com discussion on effective altruism. And this is one of the things I was doing to try to figure out what to do with my career. When I was working as an HVAC engineer, I would go to these meetups and I would talk to people and hear what they were doing with their careers. And, I made some friends, and that gave me fulfillment. Um, um, and I would say that increased my motivation, is finding that community. Really, really increased my motivation. And you might find a different community. Maybe it's in tech, maybe it's in an issue that's adjacent to tech, and maybe it has nothing to do with tech, but these sorts of groups can give you sort of a social structure to move your job search forward and move your career forward, and give you that motivation and sort of that social reinforcement that can help you if you're sort of stuck, or if you're frustrated, or if it takes a long time to do this work of maybe applying for the next job or trying to prioritize what you want to work on. It's really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, Mintbean is a community for you guys to make these connections. There's lots of developers that come in, and it's not just the guests that come in that you should reach out to increase your network, because a lot of people that are coming in are getting opportunities, and those companies are looking for their next developers. So making friends inside the community who are getting opportunities. And then, the first place that employers look for potential devs is inside their own circle. It takes anywhere from 30 to 60 days for that job posting to actually live on a job board. First, they try to exhaust, hey, do we know anyone inside our network? Are there any employees that can make like references to their friends? There's also like bonus structures that they give out to employees to like, hey, do you know a good developer? You'll get like, X number of dollars. And so, you can lean on those structures as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That personal factor might be the reason you get through the door. Yeah, who you know still matters in the job search. Well, for better or for worse, that's how it is in a lot of places. Some of the attempts to make that like more objective or more fair are also kind of like the ATS systems for resumes, and they cause their own sets of problems. But the personal factor still matters. Absolutely, it still has an impact.
Patrick, have you noticed, now that you've worked at a lot of other sustainable companies, but specific tech stacks, just from the meetups and people you've talked to, that there are particular technologies that nonprofits and these kind of companies tend to lean toward? I noticed you said you're working on a WordPress, but also some React as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just be honest with you, it is a lot of WordPress, but I'm going to make the argument that when, maybe about 5 years ago, if you said you're working on WordPress, everyone kind of goes like, ugh, like, I don't want to touch that. That's not a skill that I want to associate myself with. But it has recently um, become a serious front end, like a front end that if you learn how to use, you'll be really valuable in the job market because of the new block editor. So in the CMS system, when you're going and you can have your communications people just go and build blocks using a graphical user interface, and you don't need a developer for that. But to build the block editor itself is a React Native web application. And so now WordPress core has React Native in it. And I would make the argument that if you learn that stack, the React Native with PHP and MySQL or MariaDB on the back end, that you'll be in a position where you'll be really useful to a lot of nonprofits that use WordPress, but you'll also be really useful if you decide you want to go apply for private sector jobs because of your experience in React Native. So the short answer is WordPress with that new core feature of the React Native. I'm seeing that a lot in the nonprofit space.
Patrick, someone's asking if I think there was an automation tool that you had mentioned in your talk. I remember it too, but I don't remember the name.
JobScan. I was searching around online for how to like optimize your resume for an ATS, and JobScan came up. That it's in the slide. I will. Yeah, let me just type that in the chat. Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to share. Let me paste the link in again for the repository. Just the README has a bunch of notes in it that include. Let me paste that in again. Okay. So I'm going to upload the PDF of the slides to this repository later today. So anyone who wants to see some of what I talked about, and there's like a list of a whole bunch of organizations I didn't get to mention, some job boards. Yeah, check out that repository.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending more than, I know you had only allocated 30 minutes for us, but thank you for spending an entire hour. Really appreciate it, and learned a lot. Guys, I really hope there was a lot of good takeaways from this workshop, and you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining. Appreciate it. Bye.